Hello and welcome back to Tea with Betty. Today is a very special episode. So I sat down with Susan Crawford, who is undisputedly the queen of vintage knitting. We were going to sit down when I was at the retreat, but it was a very hectic schedule and we were both very tired. So we decided to meet up on Zoom a few weeks later to have a little chit chat about all things vintage knitting. So she very kindly gave an hour or so of her time to answer my questions. So I think we had a bit of a chat before I started recording for the interview. So I think it goes straight into the interview. So bear that in mind. It might seem quite abrupt, but it goes straight in. But I hope you enjoy me quizzing her, and I will see you the other side. So, why knitting, and what led you to where you are now, having written, is it 8 books now? And to have your own yarn range as well?
Gosh, that's a big question.
It's a big question.
Yeah.
How did you get to this point today?
Oh, golly. Well, I started knitting at a very young age. I was about 4 when I first began to knit. Yeah, but like everybody, it was who does knit, it was just sort of, something to do, really, rather than any such a great passion. But my grandmother, who was called Ruby, was a seamstress and also a knitter and an embroiderer and a crocheter, and you name it, she did it really. And so she taught me, but she also sort of embedded in me that if you wanted something, you made it. The idea that you went out to a shop and bought it was something that it didn't really dawn on me till I was much, much older and had money of my own, that was something that you did. But if we wanted something, we made it. So from a very young age, that is what I did. I would make clothes for my toys. I would make toy wells for my model farm. I would, whatever we needed, we would make. And yeah, so it started like that really. And as I got a bit older and I actually thought I want to make things that I can wear, she would share patterns with me. Now, the patterns that she shared with me were her patterns from when she had been a young woman, which was in the sort of 1930s, 1940s, and into the 1950s, I guess. And it never dawned on me that I was knitting things that were vintage. At that point they were just things and I would just follow those patterns, and so I became very used to sort of the vintage style of pattern writing. I became very used very quickly to making adaptations to them to get them to fit me, and so we all started from there really. Basically, if it hadn't have been for Ruby Nan, I don't think I would have had any great passion for vintage or for knitting or for craft really, because at school I hated it. I had the most awful needlework teacher who was an absolute
annoying when that happens and they kill your passion.
Yeah, well, she really tried. She really tried, but she didn't succeed. So that's all that matters really. So I got to about 16, and I wanted to look like nobody else. I wanted to look unique and myself. And I started wearing things I'd made. I started going around secondhand shops and buying old clothes, because they didn't even really call them vintage back in those days in the 80s. It was very much, they were just old clothes. And that whole sort of look of combining clothes from vintage periods with other thrift things, with things that you made, was, I suppose, it was a fashion in itself. And that was what I used to do. I used to I'd have a 1950s dress with something I'd knitted myself or something I'd sewn myself, and then gradually that just became to be my thing. And then I realized how much I liked it. I was working in boring office jobs, hated it, and then started doing fashion and textiles part-time, and finally went through my sort of training that way. And that was it really. That was the start.
That was going to be sort of my second question is, are you self-taught or did you study at sort of knitting or textiles, that sort of thing, at school or college or uni at that?
Yeah, well, as you said, I did, but it was very much, it was more an art based rather than
Right,
a
okay. Yeah.
skills based. So the skills were very much more self taught. I didn't get to do a knitting degree or a knitting manufacture type degree, which is really what I would have loved to have done.
Yeah.
But I did do fashion and textiles, and that was hugely helpful, really, in informing my work. And I did a lot of fashion history in that period. So that was sort of how I managed to spend a lot of time then sort of looking back at the designers from the past and getting to understand construction. I did some tailoring work. I did more specific dressmaking classes and things like that. So I did a lot of sort of the sewing techniques, and then gradually sort of applied them where appropriate into the vintage knitting.
Wow. So obviously you're inspired by vintage knitting, but what inspires you when you're creating your books, and how do you sort of choose which patterns you're going to put in those books?
Yeah, it takes a lot of time to make the decisions, really. When it's if I start with if I'm designing for myself, I normally, again, probably because of that fashion and textiles background, I do like to have a theme. I do like to hang even a single design on a story. I will always be building it on something, and it's often a person. I have either an imaginary or a real muse a lot of the time. The person who I envisage is going to wear it. It's often been vintage Hollywood screen goddesses, or it might be a character that they play in a specific film. I did a whole collection based on Faye Dunaway as Bonnie from Bonnie and Clyde, for example. So things like that. It sort of comes a lot of the time from those sort of angles, and also, of course, from fashion history. But then sometimes I'll take things more on a tangent, and it might be from music, it might be from something like that, or a genre, or something of that nature. And then I'll slowly build the story around that. With the Stitch in Time books, where I'm using vintage patterns, the very first one, volume one, was based on a pre-existing book that had been published in the 1970s. And that had black and white reproductions of the vintage patterns, but it hadn't had any work done to the patterns to update them. So that one, that had the original has about 100 patterns in it, I think.
Wow, that's
so I started to choose which would work from that as a collection, basically. So again, sort of, have we got enough sweaters? Have we got enough cardigans? Have we got enough puff sleeves? Have we got enough super dramatic sleeves? Have we got certain neckline shapes, so that we would fill or hit all the different vintage pointers that you would want to show to people, sort of, very nipped in waists, or very blouson bodies, or super puffed sleeves, all those things that would indicate the period that something came from nice and clearly. But it was also limited by what was already in the book. So there was, in that very first one, because the original book had been written in the 1970s, and in a period when there wasn't digital recreation, so it was quite hard to do things like charts or very, very complex text. I think there was only 2 or 3 colourwork pieces in that one, so I always felt that it was a bit lacking in the colourwork area. So when I came to do volume 2, I wanted to use my own pattern collection and get a more broader base of patterns, really. And so so basically I've collected vintage patterns for a long time, and I have got literally thousands and thousands of patterns and books and magazines from sort of the late 1800s right through to the 1970s, but the majority of them are sort of from that golden period of the 30s to the 50s. And because I'm really badly organised, I don't have a database to identify them all. So I literally just got box after box of patterns out and laid them all out on the floor and just began to shortlist them, and went from hundreds to a few hundred to about 100, got it down to about 40, and then started adding them again because I was like, oh, this has got to go in, that's got to go in. And I think ultimately when volume 2 came out, I think there were 80 patterns in the book, which was probably
it's quite a thick book, isn't it?
It was probably too many. But it was as I looked at it, it was a full compendium of knitting pattern history from the point it started to the point it ended. So it covered something of everything, or I hoped that it did. Yeah.
Right. So how would you sort of go about developing one of the patterns? And are there specific patterns that maybe don't translate to sort of modern bodies or a modern sort of size range? Because you are quite size inclusive with your patterns.
Yeah, there are some that aren't easy. I'll be honest with you. The book we're working on now, the volume 3, which is the Colourwork edition, Colourwork can be, or vintage colourwork can be tricky, because quite often they use very large motifs. So if you're trying to upscale something from this big to that big, and the motif doesn't lend itself to be repeated a nice number of times to give sensible graded patterns, it can be really quite tricky. So we've had a couple that have really taken some hard thinking and some unusual approaches. I have had patterns in the past that I've had to give up on.
That's a shame.
Yeah, I mean, in some respects, I think now if I went back to them, I'd probably be able to do them now. But at the time, sometimes it can be down to just how long it's going to take. Is one pattern worth spending so much longer on than all the others when you've got a whole book full to do? So sometimes you just decide, actually, it's time to call this one a day, and we'll come back to it another time. But I would say the limitations are often when a pattern has got too many immovable parts, I suppose is the best way to approach it. If a pattern has got to begin at a certain point, end at a certain point, has a very big repeat, they are the tricky ones, because it can take a lot of work to figure out how you can grade sort of in, say, 2 or 3 inch gaps, when a couple of motifs may be 6 or 7 inches in growth. So it's a bit of a challenge really sometimes. I say, in some of these have the latest book, they have given me quite a headache, some of them, but I think I've sort of saved some of the most challenging ones till the end, really, to share. And I think I'm hoping people will be quite impressed about the way that we've managed to create all the different sizes in them. Yeah, it's a bit like the JoJo pattern. That in itself was a very interesting, mathematical conundrum, that one, really. But once you find the way in, it's amazing. It's like a maze, really, with the vintage pattern. Sometimes you just need to, or a door that won't unlock. You've just got to find the right key, and suddenly you realise that there's a way that you can share it with everybody once you know that little bit of information, basically.
So how long does it take you to sort of develop one pattern and sort of do the test knit for it?
Oh, it can take, one pattern from start to finish can take months, especially if you include the sample knitting in it. It can take months. Yeah. I would start with the initial pattern We would either type it all in long on the computer as it is as the original, and then start to edit it for my style. Then I would start looking for the clues. I would normally chart it if it's a lace or colourwork, or even sometimes textured or cabled. I will create a chart so I can see where the repeat is and how it works. Once you've got that repeat sorted out, then you can start working out the maths, what it has to multiply by to work as a whole. Construction is often similar from one pattern to another. You get some that have very unusual constructions, as I'm sure you're well aware.
Yes,
but
the
lots of them,
1930s, they like to do crazy patterns.
They did. That was the decade of complete and utter just let's go for it and see what happens. I love 1930s patterns, but they can be challenging if you try and size them up, can't they? So yeah. 40s got a little bit more regimented, so they, in some respects, they're easier, but then they did use a lot more colour work, so that, as I say, that becomes complex in itself. But yeah, once you've got that far, I will then start working out whether I can do sort of a 2-inch grading repeat. And if it's colourwork, I'm very lucky. My husband wrote a program called the Fair Isle Visualizer, where we actually put in the pattern repeat and see how it works, both widthways and long ways. And then I can start planning where the armhole divisions are going to go, where the neck divide is going to come, and things like that. Because a lot of the time with vintage patterns, that can really, really matter, particularly here, that you break where it broke on the original vintage pattern is really nice to do. If you can do that for the majority of sizes, that you still get the detail at the same point so that it looks the same as the original picture. That's sort of the goal. It's not always completely possible, but that's sort of, so even though most of the vintage sweaters are knitted from the bottom up, I often look at them in terms of how will the pattern placement work from the top down. I usually start at where I want the shoulder, how I want the shoulder to finish, and then work back downwards. So, and then write the pattern upwards. yeah, make sure everything sits in the right place. Great. Yeah, so there's a lot of it just takes a lot of time and a lot of thinking, really. So yeah,
goes into each pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my tech editor often says to me, it would just be much, much easier if you just wrote this from scratch. And it would definitely be easier to just, in fact, it is, because, I write patterns as well. And I know that I can write a pattern from the beginning in a fraction of the time that I can put together a vintage rewrite.
So when choosing the types of yarns that you use and sort of the colours, are you trying to be as close to the original again, or do you sort of let your imagination go a bit wild for those?
Yeah, that can depend. Sometimes it's the original colour palette that intrigues me, and I want to knit it the same. And then sometimes, I mean, one of the issues, I'm sure as we probably all do, because so many of the pictures are in black and white.
Yeah.
You think all of them are in black and white. You sort of think, oh yeah, it'd be lovely in grey. And then you think, oh no, no, it can't be in grey. It's not really in grey. But then when you read the sort of the descriptions, a lot of them used quite similar colours. So if you do an entire book, you don't really want an entire book with every single garment using just the same handful of colours. So sometimes you have to divert from the original just to create variety in the book itself. If it's sort of, when I was doing the Vintage Shetland project, because that book was all about recreations of actual garments that were in the Shetland Museum archive. And with that one, it was important that they actually were the same colours as the garments that were in the museum. So that one I worked very, very hard to find both the same weights and the same colours and the same spin and everything as the original pieces. So that had a whole layer of complexity to the project, because many of them were actually knitted in what we would think of as vintage 3-ply.
Yeah.
So that weight that sits thicker than a lace weight but finer than a fingering weight. And it's really quite hard to get these days. It's not a weight that we really do. And so we ended up with that one actually having to have some yarn custom spin that fitted that weight, and that was Fenella, which is a yarn that we still stock now because it's the perfect.
Is that the reason why you brought out a yarn range, so that you could get sort of more vintage specific colours and yarn types?
It is, yeah. It's exactly why we started. Yeah, when we did Stitching Time Volume 2, that was what we had. I had Excelana fingering weight, or Excelana 4-ply as it was called back then, and I had eight colours, and that was it. That was all I had. I had my own fingering weight yarn and 8 colours, and I had to try and make that go over 80 designs. So that didn't quite happen. I did have to use some of the yarns as well. But yeah, that was my first foray into having yarn of my own, and that was it then. I never wanted to stop, to be honest with you, because once you can control the colours and you control the spin and you can control the weight, you can recreate anything you want then. Once you can do that, you know, there's no limit really to what you can do.
So is that something that you're going to sort of develop more in the future, your yarn ranges?
Oh, I hope so. Yes, that's certainly the plan. Yeah, there are more things
in the works.
in the works. Yes, yeah. I would like to work on. Yeah, I've just received a sample of some boucle actually, which is quite interesting. Because boucle is sort of like the vintage sort of, you know, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow.
Like a good texture, doesn't it?
Yeah, some of them it's quite difficult. Yeah, getting the right one is hard because a lot of them nowadays they're a lot smoother than really you want them to be. A vintage boucle was definitely still quite, as you say, quite textural rather than just the hint of a boucle twist or whatever. So yeah, so I've got to do that. That's very early days yet. That though, I've just got to start sampling with it and see if it works for the ideas that I'd like to use it for. Yeah, we've got quite a few more that we would like to do, but even just colour development, there are so many colours that I would like to add to the ranges. Your wallpaper is giving me lots of ideas.
This is my prized wallpaper. Cost an absolute fortune, but
lovely, really lovely. But yeah,
just to warn you, we've got 8 minutes and then it might cut out.
Oh, right, okay. Okay, so just sign back in if we
I think so. It should be able to just sign back in and it should be the same thing.
Okay.
But yeah, I've actually just bought some modern boucle that this guy who I follow on Instagram, he's a yarn dyer, and he did a range inspired by Beanie Babies. So it's all these crazy pastel colors, and it's really cool. I was like, oh my god, I need this. Like, I don't know what I'm gonna knit with it, but so I've got 4 skeins of boucle that I'm like, I don't know what I'm gonna knit with that.
So yeah, I mean, you can. One of the nice things about boucle is you can hold it with something else as well. So you could make it go further, or you could just use the boucle for part of the design.
Good idea.
You could do like a deep ribbed welt in a normal yarn, and then just have a boucle, blues on top or something of that nature.
But it's a really like modern yarn. Like, I don't think any vintage knits would look good in it.
I don't know then. I don't know.
I'm just going to stare at it and look at its beauty then. Right,
Sometimes
let me have a
yarn
look
doesn't
at the
need to be
question.
knitted, does it?
So if you were knitting for yourself, what is your favorite thing to knit and why?
I think it's changed over the years. I think I have multiple favourites now. I have become a sock knitter. Once upon a time, I was not a sock knitter ever, ever. Now I knit socks for me by choice. I really like knitting socks. I think maybe it's just the fact that I can get them done in a reasonable
Yeah,
length of time
quite like
between
a
other
small little
things.
thing to do.
Yeah, I can carry them round. I like car knitting, so I don't drive. Well, I do. I can drive, but I don't drive. So my excuse is I need to knit. So I need to make
Do you not
sure I
get
have a
car sick?
not well. Yes, I can do, but if I'm just focused on and I have to sit in the front, so I couldn't knit in the back. No, but yeah, if I'm sat in the front seat, it can distract me from all the chaos going on the road, and if it's just going round and round and round, I can do it without thinking. So I do like socks for that. And yeah, so socks, and I love knitting sweaters. I
Yeah,
have to say, I'm a big
me too.
project person, really.
There's so
The
much more
tiny
room to
or
add things,
huge.
isn't there?
Yeah, I think I like knitting for I don't know for practical reasons as well. I don't think I'm a process knitter in itself. I'm an end result knitter. I like to have something at the end of my endeavours that I want and
Yeah.
can wear and you know will form part of my wardrobe. So I knit for purpose rather than just. I don't think I've ever knitted something just to find out how a technique works or something like that. If it's a technique is built into something that I want to knit, then I'll learn that technique rather than the other way round.
So what is your favorite fibre to knit with?
Wool,
Well, any
100%
particular
wool.
breed?
No, I don't mind, but I do like a wool that feels like wool.
Right, okay. What does that mean?
Rather than well, not a slippy superwash, basically, I
That's
would say. Yeah.
like the traditional British kind of
Yeah,
binding
yeah,
style.
I would say so. This the sort of thing like I'm wearing now. It's still soft, but it's got a little bit of bite. And I do love knitting colour work. So anything that sort of enables colour work really makes me very, very, very happy. Um, and I do, yeah, I suppose I like the yarns that I produce. I like that type of yarn. I do like to know where a yarn is, what composition a yarn has. I like to know if it's got British wool in it. I do think I'm inclined to. I would always be inclined to buy British wool over anything else because I think it's great. Um, so I don't really buy wool anymore. So it's a strange thing. I don't feel I can because I have so much
Yeah,
wool
you have
at
your own
my
range.
disposal. Yeah, I've sort of stopped buying wool, which is sort of quite sad in a way, but um, I don't need to, therefore I don't. So
Um, so, is do you have a favorite era to knit from and why?
that's a good one. I do, but I think it also changes. I really love the 40s because they are neat little garments as a whole. I like the fact that they're quick to knit. I like a lot of the details in them. I also really like the fact that lots of them include colour work, which is my favourite thing to knit. Um, but as time has, it's strange. I think I don't know whether it's because fashions change or it's to do with your body shape changing, but I think over time you find different vintage periods
Mm.
that either suit you more or appeal to you more, depending on your lifestyle or say as your body changes. As I've got older, how I've approached vintage knitting and what I wear has definitely had to change. My body has changed quite significantly, certainly since I had to have mastectomy from breast cancer. That completely altered my body shape. And it does make you suddenly aware that vintage clothes are definitely designed to fit a specific body type, and that the wearer's job is to mold their body into that shape to fit into that garment. And that was something that I was suddenly unable to do. So I've sort of also been almost forced to look at different shapes and styles to work with the new body I found myself with, really.
And am I right in thinking that you wrote a book on patterns specifically for women who had perhaps had a mastectomy?
Yeah, it wasn't written specifically for women who'd had a mastectomy, but at the time I did it, I was still struggling to figure out my way forward. And so, yeah, I wrote, it happened during the pandemic, actually. I wrote I think it was actually 13 patterns. I was going to say a pattern a month, but of course, just to be awkward, I've done 13 patterns. So yeah, it was roughly a pattern a month. And it progressed through the year as I was exploring what shapes and styles suited me. And so I then decided that the best way to show that was to model them without prosthesis, because at the time I hadn't been able to have reconstruction. So they are all modelled with me with a flat chest, and so it showed that they would suit you if you were in that position. I think it also really helped sort of show that some things could be gender neutral as well in sort of style and fit too. But yes, certainly from a body shape point of view, it really, I hope it showed that there are ways that you could make things suit you that maybe you think you can't wear anymore. I was surprised at the number of styles and shapes that I was able to wear with just a bit of thought into the fit and things. But yeah, so I suppose in a way that sort of drew me quite. I've looked a lot more in recent years, sort of to the unstructured shapes of the 20s and the very early 30s. I really sort of love.
Yeah, they're quite androgynous, aren't they? The 20s, they're quite straight up and down.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, I am definitely not straight up and down. I'm still, if it wasn't for the lack of chest, I am still very large hipped, rounded, hourglass shape without the upper bit, but still. So, and yeah, I found that sort of allowing a little bit more for a slightly looser shape at the top of the body has helped me feel less like an inverted triangle, which is how I've been feeling, which I know is, I know all that's nonsense and it's what we do to ourselves in our heads, but we all do it, don't we? So
we're our own worst critics, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. And I think when you've made a career out of being a vintage person, it's quite hard to navigate a new way of being, really. So it's been an interesting exploration, and I think I can now understand fit for different shapes. I've as a designer, it's sort of it I wouldn't say it's an advantage in that way, but it can be a positive thing, actually understanding from a different side of the fence now, to where I was before and where I was again when I was younger. So, been a lot of different shapes over the years. So, so I think I do like a slightly softer fit. I think if I'm just in a more relaxed mood, but then I still, if I want to feel really smart, I will wear a nice tailored 1940s or 1930s sweater or cardigan. I still love a twin set, so yeah, that sort of 1950s, early 60s vibe I still really like. I do quite like the 70s, but
I quite like the 70s too, actually.
yeah. But you see, the 70s, they literally they took everything from the 30s and they
Yeah,
just
yeah,
upscaled it. So
yeah.
it's hard not to love it. If you like 30s and 40s, you're going to like 70s because they're the same patterns. They just knitted them on bigger needles with thicker wool. So the core elements are still there.
I'll just have a look at my questions. So I suppose similar to your favourite era to knit for, obviously you've written a book about Shetland, but are there any other regions that you are particularly inspired by? Like maybe
Oh,
Icelandic or Norwegian or anything like that?
yeah. I do really like Norwegian. I do love Nordic knits. I'm I have never had the opportunity to follow up on a research area that I was half given the opportunity to do several years ago, which was to go to Norway and go through the collection of a shoddy mill, which is where all the sweaters get taken and
Yeah.
broken into bits and reused again. But a good friend of mine called Anamore Sunbow used to own a shoddy mill, and she had a huge collection of vintage knitwear that had been left there many years before she ever even had been there or owned it. And I was always hoping that I would get the chance to do that. She's now retired and I think sold the mill. So I think that that opportunity has passed, sadly. Where else? I suppose I'm quite interested in. Well, I am interested in Estonian knitwear, but
Yes, yeah.
I think there are a lot of other people who know a lot more than I do about it. But it's such amazing, vibrant colour work. It is very, very, yeah, it's appealing. Um, yeah, I think there's something interesting everywhere you go with knits, and sometimes it's actually the overlap that is interesting. The fact that the same techniques or the same motifs or the same shapes or whatever appear in different places.
Um, I was talking to the Swedish ladies from the retreat, saying, what is the Swedish style? Because we've heard obviously a lot more about Norwegian knitting than perhaps the Swedish style of knitting, and they said, oh, actually, it's pretty much the same as Norwegian knitting. It's just they've marketed it better.
Yeah, yeah. The Norwegians did do an extremely good job of marketing it, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's like again, I just think the whole topic is just fascinating, really, because whatever you find in vintage knitting patterns also leads you to understand something that happened in the social history of that place, or something about the women's history in that place, or the fashion history in that place, and all those things merge together. So you're never just looking at a knitting pattern. You are looking at a social document that is telling you so much about a time and a place, and how usually women lived or were assumed to live, what colours they were wearing, what was fashionable, how they did their hair, how they did their makeup. Everything is there in these flimsy little four-sided little documents that we find. I just think they are endlessly revealing, and one of the most fascinating things that you can look at, really.
Is there a particular museum or maybe sort of a personal archive of someone's that you'd like to dive into?
Oh, heavens, that's an interesting one. Yeah, well, I suppose there are a few. Well, yeah, probably. when I think about it, there's probably quite a few. I've never been into the archive at the V&A.
Well, that would be amazing, I'm sure.
Which would be amazing, because they've got things like Schiaparelli things, and I guess again also the one in Paris has equally probably got the most amazing collection there. I don't know what people's personal collections are like, so that's quite a tricky one, isn't it? There's a few people, probably somebody like Sandy Black, who used to she might still teach, but she certainly used to lecture at the V&A, and the Royal College of Art, I believe, had quite a substantial archive of knitting patterns. But yeah, you can sometimes find them in surprising places. I was up in Glasgow many years ago, and the Women's Library there has got a really sizable knitting pattern collection. Surprising places have knitwear that you maybe don't expect them to have. The retreat that we had in the Lake District, Wordsworth Museum has got a collection of very personal knitted items, and sometimes they're the most interesting things that belong to somebody, not knitting but still handmade. There was a bequest to the Harris Museum in Preston several years ago from a lady who had been, from the family of a lady who had been a farmer's wife. That was sort of the term. She was a farmer's wife, and I think they'd been quite well-to-do, but she had made every item of clothing that she owned.
Oh, wow.
And she had kept records of them all, and kept many of them, but she'd kept sort of portfolios of everything that she'd made, fabric samples, what the pattern was that she'd used, and so on and so forth. And that is still, as far as I'm aware, in the archive at the Harris Museum, unused by anybody as yet. So yeah, I think there is something everywhere, really, if you can get into it, and you can rummage around and find out what they've got. They sometimes don't know what they've got, you see, so that's.
What is your most treasured knitted item or pattern that you own in your collection?
Oh, most treasured. Oh golly, that's a very, very good one. I've got some very old knitting pattern books that I suppose are very special in terms of their rarity and how unusual they are, and maybe in their wording, their phraseology, things like that. But treasured, what do I use the most? Even into that's a tough one. Treasured is hard to answer. In terms of knitted items, I actually think I've got two most treasured knitted items that I haven't knitted, and they're not particularly vintage pieces, but they're special pieces, and I think that's what knitting is all about, that things that are handmade and passed down become special. And one of them was knitted by my mother-in-law, who she passed away in 2021 at the end of the pandemic, which was really, really sad. And up to that point, for 10 years, she had been my number one sample knitter. She knitted within volume 1 and volume 2 of Stitch in Time. She must have knitted probably over 50% of 140 garments. And she kept little books, funnily enough, of everything that she knitted, and I've now got them. And they are very, very special, because she's written in each and every one what it was she knitted. She's got a little photocopy of what it was, a little sample of the yarn. But she knitted my husband Gavin's christening gown. So it's a hand knitted christening gown, and I've got that. So I would say that, and probably anything else that she's knitted me that I've still got, are probably
those definitely
really, really, yeah. And then my mum as well. My mum has now passed away as well, and she had a stroke 15 years ago that impacted on her ability to do pretty much everything, but she could still knit, and I got her knitting again, and she knitted me dozens and dozens of squares, and so I've made them up into a blanket, and that is, I suppose, my other most treasured thing, is because she knitted those for me. She thought they were a waste of time, and I was doing it just to keep her occupied, which is sort of true, but they weren't a waste of time at all, because they're a beautiful, beautiful.
I suppose it would help with sort of motor skills and using that side of your brain again, wouldn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly what it did. And even though she couldn't call it, she didn't know it was knitting, she would literally just sit there and say to me, can I do this? Can I do this? And you'd put the needles in her hand, and she immediately knew how to knit.
Oh, that's lovely.
Oh, yeah. So I suppose, yeah, so they're not vintage pieces. I've got vintage pieces, obviously, and I've got things that I've knitted from the books and things like that, or were knitted for the books. But yeah, I think things that have got a personal connection to somebody who means something to you take on a different level of
they do, yeah,
importance, don't they, as treasures, really.
And so that sort of leads me to my next question, which is, if you had one piece of knitting kit that you couldn't be without, what would it be?
Ooh, knitting kit.
Yeah, so like needles or a pair of scissors or that sort of thing.
For me, it would probably be either an 80 to 100 centimetre long fixed Addy circular in 3¼ millimeters.
Very useful size to have.
Yeah, I can do anything if I've got that.
So that sort of finishes sort of the about the past kind of questions. So tell me about the future. Do you have any more plans for books in the works? Maybe do you think you have another book in you, or are you all out of ideas for books?
No, I'll never be out of ideas. Time, maybe. Time is a different matter. I have probably 30 books in my head that wow. I would write if I had the opportunity and the time, which I'm not going to get another 30 books written, but the ideas are there. I have currently got another project that's very much in early stages that I can't actually tell you about at this moment. That is probably the next thing I'm working on once volume 3 is completed. It's very exciting. And the only thing I can tell you about that is it's a collaboration. That's the only thing I can say. Which is a new thing for me, working with somebody else. But yeah, it should be great fun and quite special. So so that's the next one. But I have got several different book ideas that I want to start on. As soon as one finishes, there's always something else waiting, desperate to get out. So and I want to develop our knitting retreats. I'm really enjoying meeting people in person. That's been absolutely wonderful. Opening our studio more where we are now in the Lake District, and making more of that. I've got a plan to have ready-made socks made up using our long sock wool, taking our wonderful long yarn right back to where it ended in the 1930s, which is when it was used predominantly for socks at that point. So I'm just starting working with a small producer to get some socks made. So there's lots and lots of things still being planned.
Talking of retreats, what are your plans for retreats in the future? Do you have any sort of plans to go maybe to further afield, like Shetland or abroad maybe?
Yeah, I don't know. I do get asked a lot about doing a Shetland retreat. Um, Maybe at some point I think I would like to do it. I think there's people who are based on Shetland who can probably do it more justice, maybe. I don't know, but I would love to do it and maybe focus on the things that I've learned. um I've toyed with, yeah, I would like to go further afield, but I haven't made any concrete plans. I did do an Italian retreat at the beginning of May, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Um, but it's a lot harder to organise
Yes.
when you're not in your home country, I suppose. So yeah, I think if somebody invited me, I would definitely go. But certainly in the UK, definitely, I absolutely love um, showing people the amazing things that we have to do with wool in the UK.
Yeah.
There's just so much, isn't there? Really, we are spoiled. So
I actually last weekend I went to a mill that didn't know we had any sort of like woolen mills down in the south of the UK, because I always associate it with sort of northern England. But yeah, I went to a woolen mill, and it was their steam day, so they had all the machinery set up like the old-fashioned way, and they were feeding the fires with the coal, and
oh
really
wow,
interesting. And they still spin a little bit there, but like nothing like they used to, obviously. But it was so interesting to learn about, how things are made.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, this is it. I mean, the textile industry was such a huge part of the UK's development. And if you go right back, wool was everything. Every
Yeah.
every bit of prosperity that the British Isles first started with came from wool. So it goes back to the 1400s and even earlier. It was such a major part of the development. So it's just endlessly fascinating, really. There's always another story. There's always another fascinating little snippet.
So, lastly, this is your chance to plug things that you're doing currently. Like, do you have any patterns that are just about to be released, or exciting things going on?
Oh, okay. Well, we are in the final stages of getting ready for the big release of Stitch in Time Volume 3. It has sadly been delayed, but we're finally now able to get ready for a big launch at the beginning of September, which will be absolutely perfect for the knitting season. So that's our major focus for the next couple of months. So there will be quite a few patterns still to reveal from that over the next couple of months. And then we've got another retreat in October, which is in the Lake District again, in Grasmere. That's actually fully booked. So I think our next availability is actually next May, when we've got a retreat. We've got a retreat in April that's fully booked. And we should hopefully be opening our little store at our studio in the next couple of weeks, onwards then, for a couple of days each week. And then I'm looking forward then to seeing what the rest of the year brings, really, creatively, because once the book is out in September, at this point I haven't allowed myself to plan beyond that. So yeah, and just enjoy it. I think just enjoy the new book being out and the things that are in it, and maybe actually getting to knit some things for pleasure for a little bit before I then start
the next book
planning again. Yeah, I mean, there's loads of things to plan, really. I don't suppose I'll stop that much, but yeah, that's really the main focus now. Is both enjoying and promoting the release of volume 3. So yeah, watch this space.
Well, thank you very much for talking with me.
Pleasure.
And that's it, it's done.
Well done.
That was great, wasn't it? So thank you very much to Susan for sitting down with us. I hope you enjoyed watching her answer all of my questions and got to know a little bit more about Susan Crawford Vintage. I will pop all of her details down in the comments for you. So if you want to go and follow her on social media or look at her gorgeous yarns, then you can do so. And go and give her some love over on Instagram as well. So I have got a few more interviews lined up for you. I've got sort of a couple in the works and one that I've actually recorded. So I think the next episode of Tea with Betty will be sitting down with a yarn and yarn shop company. So they have their own yarn shop in Shropshire, but also they have their own yarn range. So it'd be really interesting to hear about their vintage knitting. So that will probably be next month. So keep checking back, and if you want to see more interviews, then go to the interview playlist, and there's a couple up there for you at the moment. I'm slowly sort of adding to them, so hopefully there'll be many more to come. But make sure you like and share this post with all your friends so that they can see Susan's lovely interview, and I will see you next time.